Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Carruthers. I'm the interim president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's a big pleasure for me to welcome you to this event on Steven Feldstein's new book on the rise of digital repression. Unfortunately, it's become a major area of study these days, democratic backsliding, trying to understand its drivers, its challenges, and the use of technology for anti-democratic purposes is a big part of that story. When Steve came to me a little over 2 years ago and said he wanted to write a book about digital repression, I said, Steve, you better do it fast because the subject's coming on hard. Try to make it really empirically grounded, especially in some case studies in different countries, and try to make it comprehensible to non-specialists. Well, he's done all of that and more in what's really a terrific book, so I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. I'm really delighted that Anne Applebaum agreed to moderate this session. She hardly needs any introduction, but Anne is a very distinguished historian who's written some searing and probing books about different elements of politics across the 20th century, but also the 21st century. Her latest book, Twilight of Democracy, is a really incisive account of democratic challenges in Europe and North America. She's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute, and we're really delighted to have Anne moderate this session and be part of the discussion. So Anne, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom, and welcome to the audience. I too have to say that I'm delighted to be introducing this particular book. It's exactly the right book at the right time. For those of you who don't know, the author is Steven Feldstein. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. He's had a range of interesting jobs in academia and in government, in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. And so he's eminently qualified to be writing this book. In addition to Steve, we also have with us Josh Chin, who is in Taiwan, who is the deputy China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Also, for the purposes of this discussion, he's the author of some famous and deservedly widely noticed articles about Xinjiang and the encroachment of digital repression in China. And because that's one of the themes of Steve's book, I'm hoping, the two of them can illuminate one another's work. They're both real experts on this subject. This is the book, for those of you who haven't seen it. It's called The Rise of Digital Repression. It's, now available and suggest everyone on the call buy it. But let me let Steve introduce the subject first. Because one of the things that's unique about this book, there's been a lot written in vague sort of terms about the internet and its influence on politics and the ways in which China and Russia use digital technology to keep the governments use it to keep their hold on power. But Steven has also done something much more much more granular. He put together a big database looking at a huge range of countries and the way that they use digital technology, and use that to make a series of assessments about exactly who uses digital repression, how it's used, how effective it is, and what is the relationship between digital repression and more traditional forms of authoritarianism. So let me actually just start by asking Steve to give you all the background, what was the research that he did for the book, and how did that lead to his main conclusions?
Great. Well, thank you, Anne, for the nice introduction and the framing of the book. And also thanks to Josh for joining as well to kind of engage in this conversation. I really appreciate it. And it's really a nice moment to finally be here after several years of lots of research and writing and some isolation as well. So, the book, The Rise of Digital Repression, really sort of starts from its opening premise. It tries to examine and investigate how governments are deploying new tools, new technologies to counter dissent, to maintain political control and ensure regime survival. And, as part of my research, I did, as Anne mentioned, sort of a wide-ranging global study, sort of quantitatively looking at how different types of digital repression trends interact with political freedoms to better understand what types of countries are most prone to use different strategies when it comes to their repressive agendas. But I also included, as Tom mentioned, a lot of empirical case study work as well, because ultimately I wanted to get to the ground. I wanted to see what the data actually meant to the people who were either fighting back against the repression or enacting it. And so to that end, the book includes chapter case studies for Thailand, the Philippines, and Ethiopia, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little later on, each of which represents a sort of distinctive approach when it comes to new strategies that those regimes have used in their contexts. Now, I want to offer a few insights or arguments in the book, kind of based on where I've landed in terms of the empirical work and the data. It will probably come without little surprise that certainly digital repression is a growing trend worldwide that cuts across authoritarian states, hybrid regimes, as well as democracies. But that one of the most important predictors of the use of digital repression is whether there is a pre-existing pattern of repression to begin with. So in other words, authoritarian states are more prone to use a wider range of techniques when it comes to consolidating their control. And so the more authoritarian a government is, the higher the likelihood that it will rely on these techniques. But while all authoritarian regimes digitally repress, they digitally repress in different ways. And so, part of what I think is important about in our understanding is to understand why they choose different types of strategies. Some choose to manipulate the information environment through disinformation campaigns. And that's something that you see very widely in the Philippines as a case in point. Others try to use sort of mass surveillance combined with censorship filtering, as in China, as a means of control. But these are very different techniques. I think it's important to understand and distinguish between them. Now, one of the questions I approached, one of the bigger questions relates to whether China is driving the adoption of digital repression worldwide. And this is, I think, a growing concern under the rubric of digital authoritarianism, whether China is behind this kind of increase in uptake in these techniques. And what I found is that while China certainly is a model for and a proliferator of repressive technologies, pinpointing China as a primary driver of digital repression in individual countries may overstate the case, in the sense that I found little evidence, certainly in my case studies and in other places, that regimes not otherwise inclined to employ these tactics would do so at China's behest. Instead, I found there were other motivating factors and incentives that were much more relevant when it came to whether countries would take up the use of these technologies or not. So the intelligence and security capacities of their agencies, their overall technological capacity, type of leadership that's in place, political norms and practices, these were all more relevant factors, and something I think that's an important insight. Now, one other idea I want to put out is that, there's I think a big question about whether digital repression is fundamentally tilting the playing field in favor of autocrats against civil society and the opposition. And I found that in states that have extensive repression already, supported by high capacity security institutions, digital technology can have a transformative effect. So in other words, if you look at countries like Saudi Arabia, China, Russia to a large degree, this is where the kind of use of these tools combined with high capacity security forces really can make a difference in terms of breaking the back of democratic protest movements, opposition challengers, and so forth. But where governments have insufficient capacity to take advantage of these digital tools, or in liberal democracies where the effect of these techniques is more limited, then these tools in some cases can have an incremental effect. They can bring some advantages to the regime, but it's far different than the type of situation we're seeing when it comes to, let's say, Xinjiang in China. Because I'm asked that a lot when it comes to these tools. Are we looking at the proliferation of essentially duplicative situations like Xinjiang across the world? And I think that sort of takes the situation beyond where it actually is. I think ultimately you have to ground our understanding of what digital repression means in the countries, the leadership, the actors who are actually dealing with, confronting, and deploying these tools on a day-to-day basis. So why don't I stop there for a moment and we can continue the conversation. Back over to you, Anne.
Why don't we start actually by delving into one of the countries that you write about, because it's such a fascinating case, and that's the Philippines. And here, I think it would be interesting for you to explain what you mean by digital repression in the Philippines and how it is that the government uses a disinformation strategy. Because, I mean, we're all used by now, everybody who lives or works or uses the internet is aware of what disinformation is, how it gets used by politicians in various ways, how it gets used by even non-political actors in various ways to shape public opinion. But it seems as if the Philippines has gone several steps further, and the government of the Philippines has actually perfected and used trolling strategies and targeting strategies that others either haven't dared or haven't managed to use yet. Why was there such fertile ground in the Philippines for this kind of digital strategy? And what's different about Duterte? We're talking about the President Duterte, who's he's the elected president of the Philippines. So the Philippines is still a democracy. Or it's in a liberal democracy, but it's still functionally a democracy. And so why have these tools been so effective there? And what exactly has he done that's special?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question in the Philippines. And when I arrived there, I wasn't completely sure what to expect. And, the thing with the Philippines is that prior to Duterte, you could make a pretty strong argument that democracy actually was improving in terms of governance and civil liberties and so forth. So we really are looking at a sharp change in a different direction. And what's interesting about the Philippines, and this kind of goes directly to the point I was mentioning, that just because you're using digital technologies doesn't mean that you're replicating China. What we're seeing in the Philippines is very different from what you would see in sort of more authoritarian closed systems. So you're not seeing a lot of surveillance. You're seeing a little bit anecdotal. You're seeing the installation of some CCTV cameras, but by and large, it's not really part of the repression strategy. You're not seeing censorship. In fact, it remains a very freewheeling environment, both online and otherwise, when it comes to free expression. And so, that remains a good thing when it comes to those technologies. And you're not also seeing other tactics that are used by classic authoritarian regimes like internet shutdowns. But you are seeing two things kind of interact in a pretty significant way. So one, as I mentioned, you're seeing a very large establishment of a disinformation system. One that is very deliberate in terms of how it's been structured, and one that is sort of has a few different objectives in mind. So one is certainly to bolster the popularity and to support the policies of Duterte, as well as just to generally support his own charismatic rule. A second one is to diminish, discredit, harass, and intimidate those who would question or criticize Duterte's regime. And so, people like the journalist Maria Ressa, the Senator Leila de Lima, who's currently in jail, and many others who have been outspoken, particularly in the international community, about their criticisms of Duterte. They are facing trumped up charges, cyber libel charges, other sorts of charges that sort of directly are used as a means of persecution to silence them. And so this is where you see a country that is a democracy. There's a relative degree of openness where certain types of techniques like mass surveillance and censorship would not would I think lead to a public backlash, but where distorting information, manipulating the information environment is a strategy that has actually worked out and paid extreme dividends to Duterte and his ruling clique. And really the question at this point remains, is this the new status quo? Will others who are aligned with Duterte after his term ends, who run for the leadership in the Philippines, will they continue to use these techniques? And if so, what does that then say for where democracy will head in the country?
I mean, it's very striking that the Philippines is actually, first of all, it's one of the most online countries in the world. Certainly, I mean, if you look at whatever we now mean by developing world, I'm not even sure Philippines would be in it. I mean, it's a middle class country, but it's one of the most online countries, and it's also some very large majority accesses the internet via Facebook in the Philippines. Is that one of the factors that has made it easier for Duterte and his team to dominate the internet and dominate people's inboxes and content trays?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, there's sort of this famous passage or conversation that Maria Ressa had with Mark Zuckerberg, where she said, 97% of Filipinos are on Facebook. It's like the highest percentage of population in the world using Facebook. And Zuckerberg's response back to Maria Ressa was, well, what about the other 3%? So as you can see, it is very much a fact of life in that many Filipinos, consider Facebook to be the internet. And so, that being said, when you have such a predominance of a particular platform, the amount of reach that the government can have when it comes to implementing its intimidation and harassment techniques is really unparalleled. And frankly, what was interesting is when Duterte ran in 2016 for the presidency, he was the only candidate to really take advantage of Facebook's offer to advertise and to use social media as a means to actually gain political support. And he did so in a really effective way, and in a way where he saw, well, this is the way I could leverage communications for an underdog candidate who didn't have access to the type of resources and traditional communications reach as some of his other rivals. So from the very beginning, I think Facebook in particular has been intertwined with the rise of Duterte, and certainly as he's consolidated, come into power and ruled, he's really reinforced that with Facebook. So I think that certainly needs to be one of the starting points when we think about the notion of digital repression in the country.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to Facebook a bit later, but I wanted to bring in Josh. I mean, we'll get to Chinese style repression in a minute. But I'm just wondering, when you hear this description of how disinformation is used in the Philippines, and when you read it in Steve's book, how familiar does that sound to what goes on inside China domestically? Because my impression is that China, the main thrust of the Chinese use of digital repression is not so much disinformation, but rather monitoring and surveillance. Or am I wrong? I mean, is this, does China learn from the Philippines, or vice versa?
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to start off by noting that early on in Steve's book, there's a line that says, even in the Web 2.0 era, professional journalists still matter. So, which I have to say is a rare sentiment, Steve. So thank you very much for that. I think disinformation and misinformation is a really interesting question in China, because I think you're right. And in the past, it was, China's model was very much just about control. And there was a lot of disinformation and misinformation, but most of it was coming fairly clearly from state-controlled sources, right? And so it was a sort of situation in which consumers of that information, Chinese people, sort of had a good frame of reference, right? I mean, Chinese people are actually quite sophisticated consumers of information, because they know how to sort of triangulate. They've had years and years of sort of triangulating state media and trying to figure out what is actually being said. But in recent years, actually, that's really changed, and you actually now have this huge variety of voices saying a lot of different things. Some things that would never have come out of the mouths of state media, that do feel a lot more like what you would get in the Philippines. And it's not clear where it's coming from. I mean, you sort of suspect maybe it's state actors behind it, but you can't tell for sure. And I don't know if China is learning from the Philippines, possibly. There's certainly, it's something that they are trying out, and that they are getting much better at it. And as a journalist, it's actually it's made things quite difficult in terms of trying to figure out what is actually happening in China.
You mean it's made things difficult because the government seeks to tell non-existent stories or spread rumors that change the nature of the conversation?
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the sense that you now have you have state media, and they sort of say what they say, and you kind of know their agenda, and you know how to sort of decode it, right? But you also have on these other platforms. I mean, Facebook obviously is blocked in China. It was blocked very early on, but of course China has its own social media platforms that are sort of similar to Facebook. It has WeChat, which is the sort of super app that everyone lives through, where they get news and information. And you have a lot of actors on those platforms whose identities aren't clear, who seem to maybe be just sort of regular people, but then also have an unusually inexplicably large followings or reach, and seem to be kind of backed by the Communist Party, but it's not clear, right? And so it's just made it very difficult. And then also you do have other types of information sort of sneaking into China from outside of China, through VPNs, and so the information environment in China is similar. I think is increasingly similar to places like the Philippines, where the sources of information and the agendas and the reliability of it is all getting mixed up in ways that makes it very difficult to sort of find your way. And that of course, ultimately, I think it does serve the Communist Party's interests, right? Because they ultimately do control the levers of information in China, and they can sort of decide which voices are amplified and which are not.
Just
go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just say, just to also add on to that, one of the things I've noticed is that the sophistication of disinformation and the production of it is something that in the last year or two seems to have really increased in a significant way, both in terms of its level of sophistication, but also just in terms of how much is coming out of China than we saw in the past. And so what's sort of interesting in China, you kind of have initially this control environment, as you mentioned, but then disinformation is more and more interacting with that kind of in tandem. In the Philippines, what's different is that you never had the control environment to begin with. And so disinformation kind of came into this vacuum that otherwise was fairly liberal and open in terms of just how people were communicating.
I wonder, Steve, whether the success of the Duterte disinformation campaign and parallel campaigns that have taken place in other countries, was there, can you speculate at all about why it's so successful there? Was it something that we missed about Filipino politics, that was the support for democracy was weaker than we thought it was? And why is it so difficult for civil society to fight back? Does the journalist class and the human rights advocates find it so difficult to fight against the narratives? And maybe you could explain a little bit more about what the narratives are. And for example, the use of the drug war as a kind of polarizing, central narrative.
Yeah, no, it's complicated to unpack, and this is certainly something I asked a lot about. I mean, I sort of pinned it down in terms of why has it been so successful, disinformation in the Philippines, to a few factors. I mean, I think one of it is just overall democratic weakness. I mean, it's a country that has vacillated off and on between periods of kind of more liberal rule and periods where you have strongman rule, including by people like Marcos. And so it's not been a straight line in terms of being a strong democracy by any means. And so I think there's an underlying weakness or, governance tension inherent in the Philippines that I think potentially was susceptible to the type of illiberal narratives that we're seeing with Duterte. I think second, that there also is, as we've seen in many other countries, sort of this populist strain where there's, both a perception of inequality, so elites at the top really raking it in, and those benefits not trickling down, and anger about corruption and people sort of taking advantage of the system. And I think that also has sort of made the Philippines kind of prone or ripe for abuse when it comes to using narratives to prey on that anger, that resentment, especially against a kind of broader, governing ruling class. And so certainly one of the things that Duterte, who really follows along many of the kind of populist themes, like what he does is he said, it's me, it's us versus them. I will be your champion to the people who are less well off, to the people who aren't able to attend elite schools. He plays off these sort of structural dynamics and really kind of hits these buttons that Filipinos respond to, especially those who have felt disenfranchised or left out of the system for a long period of time. Again, something that I think many of us who have viewed up close populist leaders, whether in places like the United States or otherwise, can certainly, I think, find common ground with.
Mm. I mean, Josh, does that sound familiar from China, or is the dynamic different there?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Steve said, the dynamic is quite different because they're coming from different poles, different starting points, right? I mean, I think in China, it's unquestioned who's in control, and the Communist Party doesn't really engage in sort of trying to sow division, right? Because it has almost no incentive to do so, because it is in control of everything. So if there are people who are really upset, there's only one party for them to be upset with. But what they do, what they have been doing a lot more of is sort of a lot of nationalist propagandizing around the U.S. And a lot of kind of pumping up of a sort of us versus them narrative in online, particularly around things like the coronavirus, right? And I think that what has been interesting is with the coronavirus in particular is the way that the China has responded to sort of conspiracy theorizing from the U.S. from the Trump administration, right? Where people were promoting theories that the virus leaked from a lab, and and whatnot. And what was really interesting is that China had then turned around and sort of promoted its own conspiracy theories about the virus coming from being imported to China by U.S. military athletes participating in a competition, right? Which is the sort of thing that 5 years ago, 3 years ago, you would have never imagined the Communist Party, the foreign ministry spokesman ever engaging in, right? It's just almost, it's inconceivable that they would have done that. And now, Chinese diplomats are doing this sort of thing kind of all the time. And so they are kind of, not internally, but externally adopting some of those same tactics.
Mm-hmm. Let me shift the subject slightly now from that of disinformation to these more kind of technologically complicated systems of surveillance and control. This is, of course, the thing that China is most famous for doing. Beginning in Xinjiang, which I think, Josh, in the article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, you described it as the most heavily surveilled place in the world, where there are cameras on every street corner and everybody's movements are tracked and everybody's phones are tracked, and everybody's online behavior is tracked and monitored, and big data is collected from it as well. And we've seen we now know that kind of control is possible because we see it in Xinjiang. Steve, you in your book, you talk about China exporting parts of this system or parts of that, to other places. But do you see this as a danger that it could, be imposed wholesale somewhere else? And maybe we can get into the question of how it's used in some other countries. I mean, we could start by talking about Thailand, for example.
Yeah.
Is this something in countries that have close relations with China, that have an instinct to seek to control their populations? Is this something that's a purely Chinese invention, or could it be used in other places?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and actually, it really relates well to some of the reporting that Josh has done. So, one place I wanted to highlight was Uganda, where Josh and his other fellow reporters came out with a really good story about Huawei having exported a surveillance system, I think facial recognition, to Kampala, the capital city in Uganda, which was then in turn used to suppress and arrest a number of opposition politicians and civil society representatives. And so that sort of shows you, and that has been kind of used, I think, a lot as a classic example of how this proliferation of Chinese technology for repressive ends, how that can work in practice. And what I would say to that is that I definitely think this is a piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't represent the whole picture. And so kind of, Anne, back to your larger question, what would it take to, have a much wider usage and scale of the type of repression seen in China in other countries? Well, first of all, in Uganda, it would take, kind of widespread, disciplined, high capacity, coercive forces. You would have to be able to take the intelligence that's being used, make it actionable. You'd have to have, the type of resources necessary to maintain a system and a database that's able to track and monitor and then highlight particular individuals and the communications that they're emanating as a way to then monitor and deal with threats. All that is possible. Is it likely in a country like Uganda? I would say not at scale in the same way. What's probably more cost efficient for countries that don't have the type of resource base of China is to sample and use bits and pieces. So use some facial recognition, CCTV in capital cities, pair that with spyware, use internet shutdowns, social media manipulations, or taxes as needed, but use a combination of techniques based on what you have available to try to suppress dissent. And then most of all, lie about what you can do as well. Do a little bit of security theater, pretend that you have more of a capability when it comes to facial recognition than you may have, because the chilling effect ends up being as big a part of the strategy as the actual arrests and monitoring of what you're doing.
That's really interesting, actually. Josh, to what extent is that true in China as well? To what extent is their system truly effective, and is everybody truly monitored? Or to what extent does this function as a scare tactic? People worry that maybe they'll be monitored, and so they control their behavior. Do you have any sense of that?
Right. No, I mean, I think Steve makes a great point, and I think a lot of people be surprised to find that is a huge part of the dynamic in China, and that the Communist Party system is based to a large degree on security theater or surveillance theater, rather. Right. You shouldn't make any mistake about it. I mean, China has by far the most sophisticated surveillance systems. They're using this technology in a way that no other government is, and on a scale no other government really is probably capable of doing. And they really are pushing the envelope on this in a real way. But they, if you look at the way that they frame surveillance within the country, they're actually quite open about it, right? I mean, they sort of talk openly about, if they have like these big displays, right, like at crosswalks, where if you cross on a red light, they have facial recognition cameras that will like flash your face on a big billboard with your like name and maybe your like ID number. And it's all about publicly shaming people, right? And so they're very open about it. And a huge part of that is surveillance theater, right? It puts this idea of surveillance in people's minds, and that influences their behavior. Just the idea that surveillance could be, that they could be being watched is a really effective way of changing behavior. And if you look at, the great sort of metaphor for surveillance is the panopticon, right? The sort of the circular prison designed by Jeremy Bentham, actually designed by his younger brother, I think. But the whole point of the panopticon is not that you can be watched at all the time, but that you might be watched all the time, right? There are a certain number of guards in this circular prison, and they're walking around, and the prisoners never know when those guards are watching them, but they know that they can be watched at any point, at any time, and that's really, I think, how almost all surveillance systems work to a certain degree, even in China.
Mm-hmm. So I'm in Poland right now as I'm talking to you, and here, this is not a country that has anything like that level of surveillance, but we do know that the government has purchased Pegasus, which is this Israeli program that can monitor people's cell phones. And I wouldn't say it's had a chilling effect on people, but does mean that people have conversations with their cell phones, locked in the refrigerator or put in the other room or something like that. So I can testify that it functions even on that scale here. Josh, I also want to get into the subject of China exporting this technology to other countries. And I'm wondering how central you see this now to Chinese foreign policy. I mean, is this something that China considers important to do? Does it want other countries to have this surveillance technology? Is this purely a business proposition, or is there a political angle as well?
Right. I think that's really probably one of the biggest questions that comes from that most people have about China and the surveillance state, is to what extent they're exporting it to other places. And I think Steve's book does a really great job of unpacking this, because I think that the dominant narrative, it's sort of the inevitable narrative you have with China these days, as a rising kind of technological power clashing with the US, is that we're in a new Cold War, right? This is like it's a tech Cold War. And, the way Steve's, there was a really interesting part of Steve's book in the beginning where he talks about how during the Cold War, almost half of the instances in which an authoritarian regime exited was overthrown or otherwise ended was from coups, right? Whereas now that's not the case, right? The main issue is public discontent. That's the main threat. And so, I think, which just goes to show we're not really in a Cold War dynamic anymore. The sort of threats to regimes are very different. And the way China is acting is very different. I think it is exporting this technology, as Steve's data shows, but it's not exporting it in a way that's explicitly ideological, right? It's not saying here is the technology and you have to use it in the same way that we use it, right? And I think that's part of the appeal of it, is that China's just sort of like, if you want it, here it is. It's partly a business proposition. I mean, Huawei's made a lot of money off of it, but I think that the Chinese government benefits politically simply by legitimizing the idea that governments can have this technology and use it however they want, and that is fine, right? I think China's interest, and what they've stated explicitly is their interest, is in sort of disrupting this, these democratic ideas about how technology should be used, and that privacy and free will are more important than regime survival. And I think that's what they're up to. I think, I think that's what they say they're up to. And that's kind of that's the sort of the driving force behind the exports to a certain degree.
Steve, what do you think? I mean, you actually write, quite convincingly in some places about Huawei and how the Chinese, when they sell it to people, do use it as a way to maintain access to data and information about foreign countries. Which would seem to justify actually the European and American semi-boycott. I mean, it isn't 100% yet, but the American push to get American allies to stop using Huawei technology for 5G and other things as well. And yet at the same time, you have some reservations about whether this is really a policy and whether China's foreign policy can be correctly described as the export of surveillance technology, or whether it's something narrower than that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, like Josh has mentioned, like you sort of described, like it's a complicated scenario. In part, it depends on what country, what regime you're talking about. But I'll tell you something interesting that I just thought of as Josh was speaking. So in my last government job in the Democracy and Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, I would go around, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and I would talk to different governments about their human rights abuses, particularly, whether it was security force abuses, using weaponry in ways that were, violations, using technology, kind of as we've described. And invariably, one of the primary arguments they countered back to us was essentially, we have a terrorism problem. We have an instability problem. We need to make sure that if we don't use these tools, if we don't kind of keep tabs on the bad guys, the whole country will blow up. And do you want to have another Boko Haram situation, or do you want to have another Al-Shabaab situation here? And so so much of their narrative relates actually back to the kind of post-9/11 counterterrorist narrative, one which the U.S. Was one of the main, propagators of. So, in a sense, if we're going to go back to legitimization of these tools, justifications for using, repressive instruments, I think there are a lot of actors, the Chinese included, but also the U.S. and others who share some culpability when it comes to providing the justification for countries to acquire tools that are in turn used for repressive ends. So I think that's sort of part of it. And if you look at some of the case studies, whether it's Ethiopia is a good case in point, certainly the Chinese have been involved in helping build up the surveillance capabilities of the Ethiopian government, without question. But so has the United States, so have countries in Europe. In fact, it has been a variety of spyware vendors that are primarily European-based, who have increased the capabilities of the Ethiopian government up until recently to target different activists and persons of interest. So there's it's complicated on the ground, and China is an important actor and one that's growing in terms of relevance. But to sort of kind of pigeon view it as China pushing a authoritarian agenda and others kind of fighting back against that, I think really oversimplifies the context.
I mean, when you look at China and Ethiopia, Ethiopia is a very interesting case because it's actually moved in a more democratic direction recently, which is bucking the trend in the world. When you look at China and Ethiopia, do you think China looks at Ethiopia and says, we would prefer Ethiopia to have a more digitally repressive regime, or is it just a matter of selling them kit, and software, hardware?
Yeah, no, well, a couple quick points on Ethiopia. Up through my visit, I would completely agree that Ethiopia was trending in sort of a hopeful, liberalizing direction. And then by the summer, so that was last July, starting with the assassination of a prominent Oromo activist, and now leading through the civil war taking place in Tigray and the subsequent repression that's taking place, it's sort of been a kind of a whiplash in 12 months, where the initial draft of my chapter sort of pointed to signs that things were easing and that repression was starting to kind of move away, to all of a sudden these question marks about, are we just back to something as bad as what we had seen. So who knows exactly where Ethiopia will go? But
actually, that's an interesting. And does digital technology play a role in these shifts? It's a country which is very much on the edge. It can go in either direction. And does if one side or the other has better digital tools, will that affect the outcome of politics? Are we at that stage yet?
I think it's relevant. It's not necessarily the ultimate decisive factor, but it's relevant in a couple ways. So first, internet shutdowns are a fact of life when it comes to a way to control populations in Ethiopia, particularly in restive areas. So in Tigray, where the civil war is now occurring, there's been a lack of internet connectivity for months with pretty dire consequences. So that's certainly part of the strategy there. But what's also kind of interesting is that the Ethiopian government has now really kind of promoted its own kind of propaganda narratives via disinformation to the rest of the population to both justify its ongoing military operations in Tigray and other crackdowns that are taking place against particular groups or individuals. And so you are seeing kind of the advent, the kind of ascendance of a new form of kind of digital strategy by the Abiy government in a way that, even 12 to 18 months before, I think was much less prevalent, particularly on the disinformation side.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. We were meant to take questions a few minutes from now, but I've looked at a few of them coming in, and there are several of them that group together that are all pushing in the same direction. And so I want to shift the conversation in this way. And they, a number of them ask, how does the U.S. respond constructively to the realities of digital repression by allies and partners? And I would say, and then the parallel question to that is, what should the U.S. and others in Europe, and others in the democratic world and in among the Asian democracies and so on, what do they do to help fight against digital repression? Is there how should we begin to think about this as part of our foreign policy? I mean, really, it's a big, broad question, but I know, Steve, the last part of your book is dedicated to that subject, and I'm sure that Josh has thought about it as well. So if one of you would like to start talking about it, there's a separate question, which is how do civic organizations and democracy movements fight back, which I think is a little bit different. But as a U.S. foreign policy question, as an EU foreign policy question, how do you look at this? Why don't I start with Steve, and then I'll ask Josh the same question.
Yeah, no, it's a complicated, hard question. But I would say there's a few kind of initial steps that democracies could take that would sort of make a difference. And I think they relate to norms, export controls, and sort of and alliances. So in terms of norms, I think there's a lot of confusion right now. In terms of what exactly are the right ways and the wrong ways to use technology. What's the line between monitoring, tracking for more benign purposes, for law enforcement purposes, versus surveillance that actually cuts against human rights? How do we balance disinformation versus suppressing free speech? Things along those lines. So I think first it's just setting kind of a broader consensus among democracies about rules of the road when it comes to using new and emerging technologies. I think second is the export controls issue. As I really have tried to emphasize throughout the book, the export of digital tools is one that is done by a multiplicity of countries, from Israel and the United States and European countries to China and Russia. And so, one way to sort of at least put a damper on some countries accessing these tools is to create much stricter export regimes when it comes to what countries and, let's say, the OECD would do. And then the third is the democratic alliances argument, to actually have democracies come together and to push back in specific ways against different types of digital repression. And I think, the coming Summit for Democracies that the Biden administration is trying to organize, other groupings that potentially are emerging, such as, different technology democracy alliances and so forth, represent really important possible steps to begin to counteract at a government level, at a state level, some of the trends that we're seeing.
Josh, what do you think? Is this something that the U.S. even has influence on? Is there a role for the U.S. in stopping the spread of this kind of digital surveillance, or should we be offering a better, my favorite answer, which is offering a better alternative, a different form of
right.
of attractive digital interaction, which I don't think we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, thankfully, as a journalist, it's not really my job to come up with great ideas for solutions. I mostly get to ask the questions and raise problems. I mean, sort of in that vein. I mean, I think one thing. I mean, I agree that everyone I've talked to, experts I've talked to about this, they all sort of point to the idea, like Steve has brought up, and that you sort of just gestured at, which is norm setting, right? Is this idea of China does present a model. It may not sort of impose that model actively on other people, but it presents a model of surveillance and of the use of technology that other people, that other governments they use to justify their own steps, their own sort of repressive steps to kind of maintain power. And I think one thing that, as democracies, or people who live in democracies, sort of think about what they want the norms to be, I think one thing that is beneficial is to actually kind of look at places like China for what they are, and sort of to try to actually understand, that surveillance can be sort of alluring, right, for individuals and for societies, right? I mean, in China, if you're a Uyghur and you're living in Xinjiang, it's dystopian, it's nightmarish, it's terrible. If you're a wealthy Han Chinese person living in Shanghai, a lot of the digital surveillance makes your life better, right? A lot of the data collection the government does goes to like smoothing out traffic, improving healthcare outcomes, making digital payments easier, finding criminals faster, all things that, like, if you're in the majority, you're wealthy, you live in a rich city, it's good, right? It makes your life easier, and you have fewer choices, but you have more conveniences, right? And I think, Americans know this, right? We all, in the way that we sort of, Google and Facebook and all of the, internet companies, sort of, it's a similar bargain, right? I mean, they all use, ad technology as surveillance technology, right? And internet companies use that to sort of make our online lives easier, right, and simpler, and we like that in a lot of cases. And so I think part of the solution is kind of understanding that surveillance is actually an easier sell than you might think it is, and kind of grasping why that is, wrestling with that when you're sort of coming up with what the balance should be.
Yeah, that's a really useful point, actually, that I think people outside of China don't realize, and people who in other countries don't reckon with enough, which is the way in which, it is incredible how easily so many in the West give up their data and, just let all of us do it in effect, in exchange for having access to these incredibly convenient tools. And what a powerful force that is. I mean, my counter argument would be that the democratic world needs to come up with an equally attractive and equally rules-based, and more rules-based, actually, form of internet, commerce and internet conversation that offers a real and appealing alternative to the one that's being offered by China. And I don't think we've quite done that yet. I don't think saying, well, our internet is run by 3 or 4 private companies for the purposes of making a lot of money for people who live in Silicon Valley. That doesn't seem to me like a really attractive alternative to offer Ethiopia or anybody else really in the developing world. And so it seems to me that's stage number 1 of the answer. But obviously, and then as Steve says, this idea that it's only China exporting surveillance technology is equally wrong. So I'm in agreement with both of you on that. We've had another question, and this is actually because it comes close to some of the things that Steve talks about in his book, which is, how does the term digital repression differ from any other form of repression? And that's actually, you come back to this point again and again, actually, which is that they are in fact closely related. Do you want to pick that apart a little bit, Steve?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of interlinkage. I mean, in the sense that I can't think of a country that is politically repressive, that's authoritarian, that doesn't rely to some extent on one or many of these tools when it comes to their governing strategies. I mean, there's a very high correlation and relationship, which is one of the things I broke down in chapter 3 in the book in terms of actually looking at the data and how they align. I looked at it from a number of different ways, but the sort of biggest relationship I found was particularly countries that restrict political civil liberties also have the sort of highest, most prevalent ranking when it comes to use of digital repression. And so in that sense, digital repression is an extension of repression that's based on, information communications technologies. And what to me then becomes interesting is just sort of what combinations and how. So for example, is it that if you have a lower level of social media users, then you're more likely to use one or another? If you are more of a democracy, are you less likely to use surveillance, but more likely to use disinformation and so forth? And, I think where a lot of this sort of comes to bear in very interesting ways are around kind of your semi-autocracy, semi-democracies, these hybrid regimes, where places like Turkey, India is a really great case in point. That's actually a country that I'm just fascinated by, and in sort of more and more trepidation in terms of how it's moving away from some of the central tenets of democracy and more towards in a liberal direction. But and you're in Poland, Hungary. These are all countries that are sort of in different ways struggling and grappling with what combination of tools works with their political systems and will optimally allow ruling elites, governing rulers to consolidate their power. And to that extent, in some ways, there are commonalities across those that we can find, but they also end up being very individual questions on a country by country basis that, I think until you get into the politics of how things work, the traditions, the individuals who are involved, I think it's hard to really unpack and understand what the interaction looks like.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, which is whether our small panel thinks an international organization for digital information is needed, comparable to something like the WHO or WTO. Can international law have a role in setting norms? I know what I would answer to that, but let me maybe start with Josh. What do you think?
I think, I think if part of this, the question is involved in countering sort of China and countering China's view of the use of surveillance technology, I think the WHO and WTO are really instructive examples in that China has, despite being a relatively minor contributor to the WHO, financially has a very large political influence there. It has definitely figured out the WTO system and uses the WTO the rules of the WTO more effectively to benefit its own trade policies probably than any other country. And you can extend that to the UN as well. I mean, China's become a very savvy player when it comes to multilateral institutions. It actually, I think, relies on them. This is partly why one of the reasons the Cold War framing doesn't really work that well, because it assumes China wants to overturn the global order, which I don't actually think that's true. There's not really evidence for that. I mean, they sort of like the global order in some ways. And so I think based on that, I mean, I think you can sort of draw your own conclusions. I think it's not the sort of solution that China would necessarily be all that upset about.
Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I would actually, to add to Josh's point, it's not that they want to overturn the global order; they just want to co-opt it. But to me, I think the question about should we establish some kind of new UN entity to oversee these issues? Like, where's the consensus? We can't get consensus anywhere. How are you going to get past a Russia-China bloc that is fully on board with cyber sovereignty against sort of a U.S. to some degree aligned with the Europeans when it comes to kind of more open, free, accessible internet ideas? And that's just a starting point, right? I mean, we have some processes in place, like the Open-Ended Working Group that just came out with a non-consensus report, essentially, on cyber norms, because no one can agree exactly what they want, and they're completely at loggerheads. So in my eyes, the idea that we could set up some kind of UN entity and find common ground on these issues is too far-fetched. I think the best thing we have right now in the UN system in particular are groups like OHCHR, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, where some of the special rapporteurs, David Kay, who just recently stepped down, have done pioneering work in terms of establishing human rights norms when it comes to technology. But beyond that, I don't see it. Although I want to hear, Anne, your response, because I know you said you had one.
No, my response would be very similar to Josh's. I mean, when you look at the steps that China has made to increase its influence in UN organizations, and the the way, I mean, essentially those organizations all reflect power, the realities of power. I mean, the richer, more influential countries have more say in what happens inside the UN. I don't see how that's possible. I mean, we now live in an era when I'm not even sure that Democrats and Republicans in the United States could come to some kind of agreement about what internet reform should look like inside our own country. And so it doesn't seem to me very viable that we could do it internationally. I mean, the best answer I could come up with would be, I can imagine a kind of major Western, or Western is really the wrong expression, or I can imagine the democratic world coming to a set of conclusions, at least about the governance of the internet companies, and how they should be regulated in a way that seems more fair to everybody, and that could lead to a more, as I said, a more attractive democratic alternative to the Chinese authoritarian internet, and that's a model that people would then admire, and I can see that working as a means of influence. But I don't see that in this case that the UN is going to be an answer. But that's maybe my bias. There's a question here which is rather narrow, but actually hits at a big question, a larger question, which is actually to return to the subject of the platforms, which Sergey Guriev has asked Steve. He says, among 97% of Filipinos connected to Facebook, how many are via zero rating plans? These may be facilitating disinformation. These are the plans that give people no access to sites outside of Facebook. And as I recall from your book, I think that is how they have access, or them do. And that leads to the question of whether, and we sort of hinted at this earlier on, and maybe since we can begin to close with this, the question of whether how the internet platforms can be brought into this conversation in a constructive way. Is there a way to involve Facebook, Google, and others in the conversation about digital repression and digital freedom? I mean, I know that it's happened to some extent so far, but is there something that we've missed in the conversation up until now?
Yeah, no, great question. Great way to kind of conclude. I mean, I think the answer is we absolutely have to. And I think the companies themselves are recognizing that they're in more and more of a vulnerable place. I think the paradox is that as they become more powerful around the world, they're also more of a target for governments that sort of say, wait a second, we want to control what is on Facebook. We want to control what's on Twitter. And then realizing that the kind of policies they have in place no longer work anyway. So, I mean, again, India is a great case in point, especially with the recent coronavirus surge, where you're seeing actual censorship attempts by the Indian government occur on a more and more frequent basis when it comes to what is allowed or not allowed to be on Twitter or Facebook. So this is the sort of next frontier, or the next fight among many when it comes to digital repression and who controls what can be produced and consumed on the internet. And so this is it's a rapidly evolving space. It's one that's changing pretty quickly. And I think it's something that we all have to stay vigilant about, starting with citizens in democratic countries and the companies that are based there, but then working our way outwards as well to many of the places where the struggle is live. Not even the Chinas of the world, or the Kazakhstans or the Saudi Arabias, but the places like Hungary and Turkey and the Philippines and so forth, where there are chances to push back against this tide, but it's hard. And right now, the Democrats are losing.
I think that's a really great way to end this discussion, namely with the argument that at least a large part of the burden for solving this problem actually lies in the democratic world, and in the democratic world, coming to grips with its own companies and its own technologies, and creating that that appealing alternative, and that ultimately that will be the way to push back against digital repression elsewhere. I'd like to thank both Steve Feldstein and Josh Chin, as well as the audience and Carnegie, of course, for organizing this event. And once again, this is Steve's book. Everybody who's interested in this subject should go out and buy it. And of course, read Josh's articles in the Wall Street Journal. So thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you all. Thanks both of you.